Hey, scientists! It is the final week of getting our experiments wrapped up. I hope that you remembered to measure your week 3 of data over spring break. If you didn't, that's okay. You can measure it today and just on your data chart, make sure you change it to week 4 because at this point, the experiments have been running for 4 weeks if you did set them up at the same time as we were getting the project started. If you did remember to take a week 3 measurement, but you would like to add a week 4 measurement because you left your experiments going and they're still growing, then you're free to add another line to your data chart or print out a new one or make your own new one and take another measurement if you'd like. My mold experiment is still here. It is very, very moldy right now. We have all sorts of interesting mold. This one has a ton of white mold growing on it. This one has a really funny like white mold bump going on, which is so interesting. This one's sticking to the bag. So they're all a little different. And I made sure to write down all of those observations along with my week 3 measurements on my data chart. And what we're going to be doing today is taking the final totals for how much altogether the mold grew or your plant grew. So I'm going to show my data chart and let you know how to do that. Here's my data chart for my experiment with the mold growth on the hot dog buns. You can see that I took my measurements for week 3 and wrote them in that row. And then I also recorded my other observations that I took at week 3. And now it's time to fill in this very, very bottom row, the total growth that says calculated at the end of experiment. And so if you started your experiment with 0 of the thing you were growing, so for me, mold, for some of you, that might be plants. So if you started the experiment and there was no growth yet because the hot dog buns had no mold on them at the beginning, or because your plant was just a seed, so it wasn't grown yet, that counts as 0 growth at the beginning, then your total growth will just be your final measurement that you took at week 3. So I'm going to highlight that so you can see it. So I'm just going to copy these numbers down here because that's how much they grew altogether, because at the beginning there were 0 and at the end there were these numbers, these centimeters worth of growth. So my total growth for the no sugar hot dog bun was 62 centimeters. My total growth for the low sugar hot dog bun was 58. My total for the medium sugar hot dog bun was 57. And my total for the high sugar hot dog bun was 54. I'll make those nice and big because those are some of the most important numbers to reference in my experiment. So I want them nice and clear so I can see them and communicate them to other scientists who want to know my answers, my results. So the total growth is a fairly straightforward thing to do if you started with 0 growth at the beginning. But if you started a plant experiment and there was already grown plants, like you started with flowers or lettuce that was already grown in a pot, and then it was part of your experiment and you watered it or you changed what it was planted in or whatever you did to it was the part of your experiment, but you started with plants that were already a certain height, then your final total growth is going to look a little different. Let me show you what that will look like. So I made up an experiment to show you an example for that. So that is right here. I pretended I did an experiment where I took the same type of plant and I gave one of them low water, one of them medium water, and one of them high water. And at the very beginning of this experiment, I tried to make sure that you knew, if you were a plant scientist, that if your plants started a certain height, you needed to record that height. So hopefully you did. So I have pretended that in my little experiment that the starting height for the plant that I gave low water to was 12 centimeters. So I'm going to highlight that. The starting height for my medium water plant was 8 centimeters. And the starting height for my high water plant was 16 centimeters tall. So before I even did anything to these plants, that's how tall they were in my pretend experiment. And then every week I measured how tall these plants were. And if you just look at the week 3 growth numbers down here, let's make all of those blue so we can see them. You might say to yourself, oh my goodness, the plant that I gave high water to got the tallest. It's 22 centimeters. So my conclusion is giving plants a lot of water, a high water amount, makes them grow the tallest. But did that plant actually grow the most? If you take into account that it was already 16 centimeters when you started, here's what you need to do to figure that out for total growth. And I want you, before I even tell you, take a guess. What math would you do right now to figure out how much these plants grew from the beginning of the experiment, from their starting height to the final height in week 3? How would I figure out what the difference was between those numbers? If you were thinking about using subtraction or counting up to the number, those are both great strategies. There might be other ones too. Those are probably the two most straightforward ways to do it. So if I take the week 3 growth of low water, the 20 centimeters, and I subtract the starting height of 12, that means I will find the difference between them. So from 12 to 20, that will show me how much the plant grew from the beginning of the experiment to the end, not just how tall the plant was at the end. So hopefully you can do some of that math, 20 minus 12, or you could also count up from 12, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. It's 8. So 8 centimeters was the total growth it did, how much it grew during my experiment. And it's important to have that be your final number down here so that you know if what you did in your experiment actually affected the growth, not just how tall the plant was altogether. And then let's do the same thing for over here. If the medium water plant started at 8 centimeters and then got to 18 centimeters at the very end of my experiment, what was the difference? 18 minus 8, or 8 counting up to 18. If you said 10, you got it. And then over here, starting at 16 centimeters, got all the way up to 22. So did this one grow the most? What's 22 minus 16? Or 16 counted up to 22? 6. So which one actually grew the most during my experiment, my pretend experiment? The one with medium water. There was the most difference. So that leads me as a scientist to think that something that I did in my experiment, the fact that I gave that plant medium water, made it grow that distance. So that's why I need to make sure I know how much it actually grew during my experiment and not just how tall it got at the end, because they started at different heights. And which one actually grew the least during my experiment? The high water one, this one over here. I'm gonna highlight that one in red like slow growing, and I'll highlight this one in green like fast, like a green light. So this one grew the most, so I can conclude that medium water for this type of plant makes it grow the most, and a lot of water or high water makes it grow the least, and low water makes it grow somewhere in between. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you had your starting height measured so you can actually see what the difference is. Because the week 3 measurements are really important so you can do the math to figure out what your total growth was, but they're not your conclusion. They're not your answer numbers. So you need to actually do the math from your starting height to your week 3 growth height and find out how much growth it actually did altogether. And that's the numbers you'll put down here. And that's what you're gonna make nice and big and bold. So let me make that nice and big, woo! Because those are your final big result answers. So that's how you figure out your total numbers for someone like me who started with 0 of the thing I was growing at the beginning. I had no mold starting at the beginning. So what I just got to do was look at my week 3 measurements, and that was also my total growth answer. And then also I just showed you how to figure out your total growth if you started with not 0. If you started with a plant or something that was already grown, how do you figure out how much more grew on top of that during your experiment? So if you never took your final data measurements for week 3 during spring break, make sure you do that today. Just change it to say week 4, and then make sure you record your total growth at the bottom of the data chart. And tomorrow in science class, we'll be learning the steps to go through to write your conclusion and think about what your answers mean. Because what are your answers in this experiment? What did you discover? What can you announce to the world as a scientist in your conclusion? I'll help you figure that out tomorrow. So today, just make sure all of your data is recorded and that bottom row is filled in with your total growth for your mold or your plants. Oh, and before you throw anything away, make sure you take a picture or a video of what your final results look like if you haven't done that yet.